Good morning, everyone. And thank you to Halldale for giving me the opportunity to speak with you this morning. It's both a pleasure and an honour to do so. We're now 11 years into the ICAO language proficiency requirements, and yet I still see students and their instructors struggle with language proficiency. But he's got level 4. Why is he struggling? I hear this time and time again. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for a rethink on English language proficiency for aviation training. At Latitude, we've been doing some research and analysis of the language proficiency requirements for Ab-initio students, and it is this research that I would like to talk to you about today. This will be an interactive session, and you will need to talk to the person sitting next to you. So make sure you're sitting next to someone you either like or like the look of. And the things we will cover are as follows. Firstly, we'll have a look at English for specific purposes. Then we'll have a look at the challenge that English language proficiency represents for the aviation industry. And we'll look over the ICAO requirements and why they are the wrong way of thinking when it comes to ab-initio aviation training. We'll then talk briefly about some research that we did into language skills and levels for ab-initio pilots. And finally, we'll have a look at what all of this means for training and assessment in the future. So let's begin with a short activity. Working with the person sitting next to you, you should see a worksheet like this somewhere on your desk. So with task 1, you have 1 minute to work together and tick the things you can do successfully in English. So 1 minute, tick the things you can do successfully in English. Okay, a show of hands. Who here can speak with air traffic control on descent and landing? Great. Who can write a financial report for an airline board of directors? Pretty good, but not everyone. Who can read and understand a government procurement contract? Who can give a presentation at an industry conference? Okay, pretty good. And who can give a live radio commentary on a test cricket match? So few. What is the world coming to? Now, there's my point. It's not that your language proficiency isn't good enough. It's that you don't know anything about cricket, right? Language proficiency, or your ability to do things with language, is linked very much to your subject matter knowledge. You can't have one without the other, and we'll return to this point in a moment. But with that in mind, let's have a look at the challenge then. You all know the forecasts. They're formidable. ICAO in 2010 forecasted that the population of the world's pilots and air traffic controllers would double in the next 20 years. In 2011, Boeing predicted a demand for 92,000 additional pilots in Europe and 36,600 in the Middle East. And this year, Airbus's global market forecast repeats a similar message. Now, the majority of today's airline pilots do not have English as their first language, and looking at the forecasts, it's quite easy to see that the world's future pilots will also not have English as a first language. A lot of the world's aviation training capacity is in the English-speaking world, USA, UK, South Africa, Australia, for example. However, much of the aviation training that is not in the English-speaking world is conducted in the medium of English. In order for the industry to grow, a lot of personnel need to be trained. So the challenge is to remove the language barrier so that we select confidently, train the candidates efficiently, and reduce the training risk associated with inadequate language proficiency. In 2003, ICAO introduced a language proficiency standard for international operations. You all know about ICAO Level 4, so I'm not here to tell you about that. But what I will do is tell you what ICAO Level 4 isn't, and more importantly, why it's not a suitable level of language proficiency for ab-initio pilots. Now, none of what I'm going to say should be interpreted as a criticism of ICAO or of ICAO Level 4. Of course, there are issues with the implementation of the requirement, but ICAO's efforts to improve safety are laudable, and I'm sure no one would argue that English for safe RT communications is a bad thing. But that is not my point. Let's look in more detail. Firstly, ICAO states that pilots and air traffic controllers shall demonstrate the ability to speak and understand English used for radio telephony communications. Radio telephony communications is the emphasis here. Furthermore, ICAO states that the rating scale has a distinct aeronautical radio telephony focus. It addresses the use of language in a work-related aviation context, voice-only communications using strategic competencies for safe communications in case of complications or unexpected turn of events. Now, just as many of you couldn't give a radio commentary on Test cricket, how can we expect an ab-initio pilot to speak and understand the language used for RT communications when they haven't even stepped into an aircraft to fly it? Let's look at this more closely. Here are 5 of the 6 ICAO criteria at level 4. Structure and vocabulary both refer to unusual or unexpected circumstances, which could be anything from an unruly passenger to a foreign object on a taxiway to something more serious like a lithium battery fire or a depressurization. Fluency refers to the transition from rehearsed or formulaic speech to spontaneous interaction, which in the context of aviation operations can only mean the transition from standard phraseology to plain English in a non-routine situation. Vocabulary and comprehension both refer to work-related topics, and comprehension and interactions both refer to unexpected turn of events. Could we expect an ab-initio pilot to talk about the work of a pilot, or to switch between standard phraseology and plain English, or deal with an unexpected turn of events when they haven't yet begun training? ICAO state quite clearly that level 4 is the minimum level required for RT communications. We question whether this level is appropriate or sufficient for ab-initio aviation training. ICAO also states that the rating scale does not address reading, which is a skill crucial for successful ab-initio training. When pilots with a level 4 endorsement began failing simulator tests, Captain Mahoney of Emirates said that he thought ICAO level 4 certificates were not worth the paper they are written on. Indeed, Andy O'Shea yesterday said that English language is still one of the major issues facing pilot selection and training today. There are certainly quality issues in testing for ICAO level 4, but in terms of subject matter knowledge, using the ICAO rating scale for ab-initio pilots is like putting the cart before the horse. In terms of skills, it's quite simply the wrong cart. We need to rethink language for ab-initio training, and to do this, we might ask 4 questions. What knowledge does the student have? Why are we training and assessing? What does the student need to do? And at what level of competence? In terms of licensed pilots, we know they are knowledgeable about aviation and competent to exercise the privileges of their license. In terms of assessment, we know we are testing for flight crew licensing, And we know we are doing this for safe RT communications, at or above ICAO level 4. But what about student pilots? Working with the person next to you, in column 1, you have 1 minute to tick the things that an Ab-initio student might do in week 1 of aviation training. 1 minute, tick the things an Ab-initio pilot might do in week 1 of aviation training. Okay, are we done? I would imagine you answered something like that. Remember, week 1 of aviation training. Again, 30 seconds, in column 2, tick the things which are covered by ICAO level 4. Okay? I would imagine you answered something like that. This shows us just how restricted the ICAO language proficiency requirements are. They may cover English for safe RT communications, but they don't cover the range of job-related competencies that pilots require in day-to-day work activities, and they don't address the skills that student pilots require when they begin their aviation training. So we know that an Ab-initio pilot has zero knowledge. We know that we are training and testing so that aviation training organisations can be confident that they are able to cope with the demands of English medium professional training. We know we are not concerned with RT communications, but rather we are training and testing for successful aviation training, and we know we are not training to ICAO level 4. So then, if not level 4, then what? This is a question we asked ourselves back in 2012, and we turned to the Common European Framework of Reference, or the CEFR. The CEFR, developed by the Council of Europe, is the product of over 20 years of research and is designed to be a transparent, coherent and comprehensive basis for the elaboration of language syllabuses, the design of teaching and learning materials, and the assessment of foreign language proficiency. Unlike the ICAO rating scale, it covers all language skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. The CEFR has 6 levels, from A1 to C2, where A1 is complete beginner and C2 is equivalent to mastery of a language. And you can find out more information about the CEFR here. The CEFR allows comparison of language levels across languages and for different purposes. For example, the CEFR allows you to compare a test of English with a test of German, or a test of Spanish with a test of Turkish. Much language training and assessment in Europe, and increasingly in the Middle East and South America, is linked to the CEFR. It is an established, robust, and credible system of referencing language level. We thought if the CEFR can work for governments, for universities, and for businesses across Europe, then surely it can work for Ab-initio aviation training as well. To find out, we turned to industry experts. Our mission was to begin to map expert judgments of language needed for successful aviation training with the CEFR in order to, firstly, confirm our ideas about the skills required and to give us a robust description of level. Between 2012 and 2013, we gave a 25-minute questionnaire to 14 flight, air traffic control and maintenance instructors from 3 well-known providers of English medium Ab-initio aviation training. We presented 11 tasks across 53 descriptors from the CEFR at 3 different levels, A2, B1 and B2. Of course, in an ideal world, all of our students would have C2 or complete mastery of the language, but we don't live in an ideal world. So we chose B2 as the maximum for 2 reasons. Firstly, B2 is used as an entry requirement for much undergraduate and postgraduate education all across Europe. Secondly, because setting the bar higher, C1 or C2, for example, would exclude many students who would otherwise have adequate language proficiency. Let's have a look at the results for one of the 11 tasks. In this case, listening as a member of a live audience. Now, this is interesting because this is exactly what Ab-initio pilots do on day 1 of their training, and it's also what you are doing right here at this conference right now. So, the first question we asked of our judges was, is the task relevant? And as you might expect, all of them said yes. The second thing we asked them to do was to consider entry requirements for aviation training, thinking about students who are firstly not ready for aviation training, are borderline, i.e. they may struggle with language once they begin ground school, or are ready for aviation training. Then we presented the descriptors for the task at A2, B1 and B2, but we didn't tell them what the levels were. Here they are. 30 seconds with your partner. Can you decide which descriptor applies to a student you think is ready for English medium aviation training? Any volunteers? 1? Anyone else? 2 are here. 1, 2, 3. Here are the results. 13 of the 14 judges decided that the first descriptor describes someone who is ready for aviation training. For the second descriptor, opinion was divided. The majority decided it described a student who is borderline, where a student might encounter some problems with language. And for the third descriptor, agreement was stronger once again. A majority decided that this describes a student who is absolutely not ready to begin English medium aviation training and who would struggle during ground school. In terms of CEFR levels, the first descriptor is B2, the second B1, and the third A2. The results for all 53 descriptors across 11 listening and reading tasks follow the same pattern. Firstly, the majority decided that A2 descriptors apply to students who are not ready for aviation training. The majority also decided that B1 descriptors apply to students that are borderline. This was weaker agreement, with a significant number also deciding that the descriptors apply to those who are ready and not ready. However, by far the strongest agreement was at B2, where a very strong majority decided that they described students who are ready for professional English medium aviation training. So through this focused expert judgment exercise, we were able to establish that CEFR B2 in listening and reading is a relevant minimum level of language proficiency to begin ab-initio aviation training. So what does this mean for training and assessment? Well, firstly, it means that we have clear, well-defined learning objectives in the very skills that student pilots require and in the very skills that are not addressed by the ICAO language proficiency requirements. We have robust guidance on learning time required, which has had the benefit of years of careful development and refinement by linguists from all across Europe. For example, Cambridge University, Deutsche Welle and Alliance Française all point to similar learning times as follows. A2, not ready for aviation training, more than 200 hours. B1, borderline, between 25 and 200 hours, and then B2, ready for aviation training. With the CEFR, we have clear and obvious domain-specific training and testing targets. These are, for example, reading technical manuals on a variety of subjects, from general navigation to meteorology, human factors to principles of flight. And they include listening to instructors in the classroom and out, and talking to training centre staff and other students about topics related to flight training. Training and testing must focus on these skills in order to be relevant, meaningful, and engaging for the students. In learning to speak English in this domain-specific context, students will not only be prepared for day one of their training, but they will also be motivated to learn, motivation which is essential for successful aviation training. At the same time, while we have to teach language in the context of aviation training in order to maximize the relevance and validity, we have to be careful. We have to tread a tightrope between aviation subject matter and language knowledge. Of course, it is not the job of language instructors to teach subject matter. This very delicate balance between language and knowledge will hopefully be the subject of future research and presentations. So to wrap up, with ab-initio aviation training, we know students don't yet have sufficient aviation knowledge to use the ICAO scales. We know we are preparing not for operational safety, but for training efficiency. We know we are preparing not for licensing, but for successful selection and entry into training. We know the skills are not listening to ATC, but listening to instructors, reading technical manuals, and speaking to staff and students. We know we are focusing not on plain English for RT communications, but we are focusing on ATPL subject matter. ATPL Ground School is a highly demanding, classroom-based technical training course that requires, on day one, advanced listening, reading, and speaking skills. Based on our research, we would argue that B2 is a minimum admission requirement for demanding technical training. So going back to the demand that exists for pilots today, and considering the language proficiency and subject matter knowledge in training and testing, we need to place assessments at the right position on the training pathway. Now, the right place for ICAO Level 4 is once aviation training is well underway, once the students have knowledge and experience of using the radio. Remember that Level 4 is described as the minimum level for safe RT communications. Unfortunately, ICAO Level 4 doesn't mean that pilots will have enough English language proficiency to deal with much more complex tasks, such as assessment, a type rating, an OCC, or many of the other day-to-day operational activities which are not addressed by the ICAO requirements. However, we would submit that accurate, specific purpose training and testing at the beginning of English medium training is the key to long-term language proficiency gains for the industry. and would help remove the language barrier that the industry still faces today, 11 years after the introduction of Level 4. If a student can successfully achieve MEIR in the medium of English, ICAO Level 4 Plus is going to be a piece of cake. So to train the world's future pilots, we need to select with confidence, we need to maximise training efficiency, and we need to minimise the training risk associated with inadequate language proficiency. And to remove the language barrier, we, the aviation training industry, need to train through relevant, valid content, train the appropriate skills, which includes reading, and we need a proficiency target which is commensurate with the demands of professional aviation training. We submit that this level is CEFR B2. Thank you very much.